On the morning of April 17, 1983, a man named Thomas Archer walked through the gates of Mosfilm studios in Moscow, carrying a leather portfolio and a false sense of security. He was 41 years old, originally from Philadelphia, and for the past 6 years he had been living under the identity of Edward Brennan, a Canadian documentary filmmaker with credentials that had been meticulously constructed by the Central Intelligence Agency. His real mission had nothing to do with cinema. He was there to photograph classified technical specifications for Soviet radar jamming equipment that had recently been delivered to a research facility adjacent to the studio lot. What Thomas did not know, what he could not have known despite all his training and all his carefully rehearsed protocols, was that the KGB had been watching him for 11 weeks. They knew his routines, his contacts, his weaknesses, and they had been waiting for him to make the exact move he was about to make. The decision to place Thomas Archer inside Mosfilm had been made in Langley, Virginia, during a strategic planning session in October of 1982. The facility was an unusual target. Mosfilm was the largest and oldest film studio in Russia, a sprawling complex of sound stages, editing suites, prop warehouses, and administrative buildings that stretched across more than 80 acres in the northwestern part of Moscow. It produced hundreds of films each year, everything from state-approved propaganda pieces to historical epics to experimental works that pushed the boundaries of what Soviet censors would allow. But what made Mosfilm strategically valuable to American intelligence was not its cultural output. It was the fact that the studio complex shared a perimeter fence with a military research facility known as Object 47, a classified site where Soviet engineers were developing electronic countermeasure systems designed to interfere with NATO radar and communication networks. The proximity was not accidental. Soviet planners had long used the practice of embedding sensitive military installations inside or adjacent to civilian infrastructure, making it difficult for Western intelligence agencies to conduct surveillance without drawing attention. A spy watching a film studio could be explained away as cultural interest. A spy watching a military research facility was grounds for arrest. The CIA had been trying to penetrate Object 47 since 1979, but every conventional approach had failed. Direct infiltration was impossible. The site was guarded by armed personnel from the GRU military intelligence, and access was restricted to scientists and engineers with the highest security clearances. Signals intelligence had yielded little. The facility was electronically shielded, and all communications were conducted through hardline connections that could not be intercepted remotely. Human intelligence assets inside the Soviet military-industrial complex had been unable to provide useful details. Either they lacked access to the specific programs being run at Object 47, or they were too frightened of discovery to take the risks necessary to obtain information. Then in September of 1982, an opportunity had presented itself. A Canadian production company called Northern Light Films had been granted permission to shoot a documentary about the history of Soviet cinema, with extensive access to Mosfilm studios and its archives. The project was legitimate, funded by the Canadian government and approved by the Soviet Ministry of Culture. The director attached to the project was a man named Edward Brennan, a respected filmmaker who had previously worked on documentaries about European theatre and the reconstruction of Berlin after World War II. What Soviet authorities did not know was that Edward Brennan did not exist. The real filmmaker had died in a car accident outside Toronto in 1978, and the CIA had quietly taken over his identity, building out a complete legend with passport, bank accounts, tax records, film credits, and even fabricated interviews in Canadian arts journals. The man who would be using that identity was Thomas Archer, a case officer with 12 years of experience in Soviet operations. Thomas had been recruited into the CIA in 1971, fresh out of graduate school where he had studied Russian literature and language at Georgetown University. He had spent his first 2 years working in analysis, translating intercepted Soviet communications and compiling reports on political developments within the Kremlin. But he had grown restless with desk work, and in 1973 he had applied for field operations. His language skills, his ability to blend into academic and cultural circles, and his unassuming appearance made him an ideal candidate for deep cover assignments. He was not physically imposing. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, slender, with thinning brown hair and glasses that gave him the look of a bookish intellectual. He could pass as a professor, a journalist, a bureaucrat. People rarely remembered him, which in his line of work was the most valuable quality anyone could have. Over the next decade, Thomas had operated in East Berlin, Prague, and Budapest, running agents, facilitating dead drops, and gathering intelligence on Soviet military deployments and political purges. He had been careful, disciplined, and successful. He had never been arrested, never blown a cover, never lost an asset to KGB counterintelligence. But the Moscow assignment was different. Moscow was the hardest operational environment in the world for Western intelligence officers. The KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for internal security and counterintelligence, employed tens of thousands of officers and informants whose sole job was to identify and neutralize foreign spies. Surveillance was constant, pervasive, and sophisticated. Hotels were bugged, taxis were monitored, restaurants had informants. Even casual conversations with strangers could be reported to authorities. An intelligence officer operating in Moscow had to assume that every move was being watched and plan accordingly. The cover story for Thomas Archer as Edward Brennan was solid as any legend could be. He had arrived in Moscow on January 23, 1983, carrying a Canadian passport, letters of introduction from Northern Light Films, and a detailed proposal for a documentary that would focus on the golden age of Soviet cinema from 1920 to 1950. His credentials had been reviewed by the Soviet Ministry of Culture, which had granted him a 3-month visa and assigned him a liaison officer from the ministry, a woman named Irina Voronova, who would facilitate his access to archives, interview subjects, and filming locations. Irina was in her late 30s, efficient and businesslike, with short dark hair and a manner that suggested she took her responsibilities seriously. Thomas understood immediately that she was also KGB. Her job was not just to help him make a documentary, it was to watch him, to report on his movements, to identify any behavior that might suggest he was something other than what he claimed to be. For the first 6 weeks, Thomas played his role flawlessly. He conducted interviews with elderly directors and cinematographers who had worked during the Stalin era. He spent hours in the Mosfilm archives, reviewing reels of old films, taking notes, asking questions that demonstrated genuine knowledge of Soviet cinema history. He filmed establishing shots of the studio lot, the iconic statue of the worker, and the collective farm woman that stood at the entrance, the vast sound stages where epics like War and Peace had been shot. He was polite, professional, and meticulous. He never deviated from his schedule without notifying Irina. He never asked questions that seemed out of place. He never displayed any interest in the parts of the studio complex that were off-limits to visitors. And most importantly, he never went anywhere near the perimeter fence that separated Mosfilm from Object 47. But while Thomas was building his cover, he was also gathering intelligence. He had been briefed extensively before arriving in Moscow. The CIA had provided him with detailed maps of the Mosfilm complex, including the locations of all buildings, utility access points, and security checkpoints. He had been told that Object 47 was located on the eastern edge of the studio lot, behind a 12-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The facility consisted of 3 low concrete buildings, a vehicle depot, and a small guardhouse where GRU personnel monitored access. Deliveries to the facility occurred on Tuesdays and Fridays between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Trucks would enter through a gated access road that branched off from the main Mosfilm entrance, and they would remain inside the compound for approximately 45 minutes before exiting. The CIA believed that classified materials, including technical documents and equipment prototypes, were being transported in those trucks. And if Thomas could gain access to one of those shipments, even for a few minutes, he might be able to photograph documents that would reveal critical details about Soviet electronic warfare capabilities. The plan was risky, but not impossible. Thomas had been equipped with a miniature camera disguised as a fountain pen, a device that could photograph documents at close range without arousing suspicion. He also carried a small electronic scanner that could detect radio frequencies and signal patterns hidden inside a film light meter. The challenge was finding a way to get close enough to the trucks without triggering security protocols. For that, Thomas needed an opportunity, a moment when the normal routines of the studio would provide cover for him to move into a restricted area without being immediately detected. That opportunity came on April 15, 1983. Irina had informed him that a major production was being filmed on one of the sound stages near the eastern perimeter of the lot. The film was a historical drama about the siege of Leningrad, and the director had requested access to military vehicles and equipment for authenticity. Several Soviet army trucks had been brought onto the studio grounds as props, and they were being staged near the fence line, less than 100 yards from the Object 47 access road. Thomas saw the setup during a walk through the lot that afternoon. The trucks were parked in a gravel lot adjacent to Soundstage 11, surrounded by film crew members, actors in military uniforms, and equipment carts loaded with cameras, lights, and cables. It was chaotic, crowded, and loud, and it was exactly the kind of environment Thomas needed. If he could blend into the crew, if he could position himself near the trucks during a delivery window, he might be able to photograph documents or equipment that would otherwise be inaccessible. He spent the next 2 days refining the plan. He obtained permission from Irina to film behind-the-scenes footage of the Leningrad production, explaining that it would provide valuable context for his documentary about the evolution of Soviet filmmaking. Irina agreed, and on the morning of April 17th, Thomas arrived at Soundstage 11 carrying his camera equipment and his false sense of security. What Thomas did not know was that he had been under active surveillance since March 9th. The KGB had received a tip from an informant inside the Canadian embassy in Moscow, a low-level administrative assistant who had noticed irregularities in the paperwork associated with Northern Light Films. The company existed, and its credentials were legitimate, but when the informant had made inquiries with colleagues in Ottawa, she had learned that no one at the Canadian Film Board had ever heard of Edward Brennan. The director whose name appeared on the documentary proposal had no traceable history in Canadian cinema beyond a handful of obscure credits that seemed to have been fabricated. The informant had passed the information to her KGB handler, and within 48 hours, a full counterintelligence investigation had been initiated. The second chief directorate had assigned a surveillance team to monitor Thomas Archer around the clock. Officers followed him on foot and in vehicles. His hotel room was searched repeatedly while he was out. His phone calls were recorded. His mail was intercepted and photographed. Every conversation he had with Irina Voronova was analyzed for inconsistencies. At first, the KGB found nothing incriminating. Thomas behaved exactly as a documentary filmmaker should behave. He conducted interviews, filmed B-roll footage, took notes. He showed no interest in military installations, government buildings, or restricted areas. But the surveillance team was patient. They understood that trained intelligence officers could maintain cover for months, waiting for the right moment to act, and so they watched, and they waited. Then on April 12th, a KGB surveillance officer stationed near Mosfilm noticed that Thomas had spent an unusual amount of time observing the trucks parked near Soundstage 11. He had walked past the area 3 times in 2 days, always pausing to watch the crew work, always positioning himself where he had a clear line of sight to the Object 47 fence line. The behavior was subtle, but it was enough to raise suspicion. the surveillance team increased its focus on Thomas, and they began preparing for the possibility that he was planning an operation. On the morning of April 17th, as Thomas Archer walked through the gates of Mosfilm Studios, he was being watched by 6 KGB officers positioned at various points throughout the complex. 2 were dressed as film crew members. 1 was posing as a security guard at the entrance to Soundstage 11. Another was monitoring from a vehicle parked near the Object 47 access road, and 2 more were stationed inside a utility building with a direct view of the gravel lot where the trucks were parked. They had been instructed not to intervene immediately, but to observe and document Thomas' actions. If he attempted to photograph restricted materials, if he made contact with anyone inside the facility, if he did anything that confirmed he was operating as an intelligence officer, they would move in and arrest him. But the KGB wanted more than just an arrest. They wanted to understand his network, his methods, his handlers. And so they waited. Thomas arrived at Soundstage 11 at 9:42 in the morning. The production was already underway. Actors in Soviet Army uniforms were standing in formation while the director shouted instructions through a megaphone. Cameras were rolling, lights were blazing. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of voices, machinery, and movement. Thomas moved slowly through the crowd, filming with his handheld camera, nodding politely to crew members who glanced his way. He positioned himself near the trucks, approximately 30 yards from the fence line. From there, he could see the Object 47 access road clearly. At 10:15, a delivery truck entered the compound through the gated entrance. It was a standard Soviet military transport vehicle, painted olive green, with a canvas cover over the cargo bed. Thomas watched as the truck drove past the guardhouse and disappeared behind the concrete buildings. His pulse quickened. This was the window. The truck would remain inside the compound for approximately 45 minutes, and during that time there was a chance, however small, that he could get close enough to the fence to photograph something useful. Thomas moved casually toward the edge of the gravel lot, pretending to film the actors and crew. He checked his watch. 10:23. He calculated the timing in his head. If he could reach the fence by 10:30, he would have roughly 20 minutes before the truck emerged and security personnel became more alert. He adjusted his grip on the camera and began walking slowly toward the perimeter. He was less than 15 yards from the fence when a voice called out behind him. It was in Russian, calm but firm. He turned and saw a man in his mid-40s wearing a dark jacket and no identifying uniform. The man's face was expressionless, and he was flanked by 2 others who had appeared from different directions. Thomas felt the air go out of his lungs. He knew immediately what was happening. He had been compromised. The man in the dark jacket asked for his identification. Thomas handed over his Canadian passport and his press credentials, maintaining the fiction even though he understood it was over. The man examined the documents without speaking, then looked up and said that Thomas needed to come with them. There were questions that needed to be answered. Thomas was escorted to a building on the far side of the studio lot, away from the production area and the main gates. The building was unmarked, a 3-story concrete structure with narrow windows and a steel door. Inside, the hallways were dim and smelled of disinfectant. He was taken to a room on the 2nd floor, a small space with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single overhead light. The man in the dark jacket sat across from him and introduced himself as Major Yuri Sokolov from the Committee for State Security. He did not waste time. He told Thomas that they knew who he was, that they had been watching him since March, that they had documented his movements, his contacts, and his attempts to access restricted areas. He said that Thomas had 2 choices. He could cooperate, provide information about his handlers and his mission, and receive consideration for leniency. Or he could remain silent, be formally charged with espionage, and face a military tribunal that would almost certainly result in a lengthy prison sentence. Thomas said nothing. He had been trained for this scenario. He knew that the first hours of interrogation were critical, that the interrogators would try to break him psychologically before moving to harsher methods. He focused on his breathing, kept his face neutral, and did not respond to Sokolov's questions. The interrogation lasted for 6 hours. Sokolov asked about the CIA, about Langley, about the names of officers Thomas had worked with. He asked about the camera equipment, about the fountain pen with the hidden lens, about the electronic scanner disguised as a light meter. He asked about Thomas' contacts in Moscow, about whether he had been meeting with Soviet citizens who might be passing information. Thomas denied everything. He insisted he was a documentary filmmaker, that the accusations were absurd, that there had been a misunderstanding, but Sokolov was not interested in denials. He had evidence. He presented photographs that had been taken during the surveillance operation. Thomas walking past the Object 47 fence. Thomas examining the trucks near Soundstage 11. Thomas standing in locations where he had no legitimate reason to be. At 6:30 in the evening, the interrogation was suspended. Thomas was moved to a detention cell in the basement of the building, a windowless room with a cot, a sink, and a toilet. He sat on the cot and tried to assess his situation. He had been caught, but he had not admitted anything. The KGB had evidence of suspicious behavior, but they did not have definitive proof of espionage. They had not found any classified materials in his possession. They had not caught him in the act of photographing documents. His cover story was thin, but it was not completely destroyed. There was still a possibility, however remote, that the Canadian government would intervene, that diplomatic pressure would force the Soviets to release him. But Thomas knew the reality. The KGB did not arrest people without cause. They had been watching him for weeks. They knew more than they were revealing. And even if he managed to avoid a formal confession, he would likely spend years in a Soviet prison while his case was negotiated behind closed doors. Over the next 3 days, the interrogations continued. Sokolov brought in additional officers, specialists in psychological manipulation, who used different techniques to try to break Thomas' resistance. They alternated between aggression and sympathy, between threats and promises. They told him that his government had abandoned him, that no one was coming to help, that his only chance was to cooperate. They showed him documents they claimed had been recovered from CIA safe houses in other countries, documents that supposedly implicated other American operatives. They told him that if he provided names, if he gave them something useful, they could arrange for him to be released and returned to the United States. Thomas refused. He knew that once he started talking, once he provided even the smallest piece of information, he would lose whatever leverage he had left. On April 21st, 4 days after his arrest, Thomas was formally charged with espionage under Article 64 of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic Criminal Code. The charge carried a maximum sentence of 15 years in a labor camp. The trial was scheduled for June 15th in a closed military court. Thomas was assigned a Soviet defense attorney, a middle-aged man named Viktor Petrov, who seemed disinterested and resigned to the inevitability of conviction. Petrov told Thomas that his best option was to plead guilty and ask for leniency, to express remorse and cooperate with authorities. Thomas refused. He would not plead guilty to a crime he could not admit, even if it meant spending the rest of his life in prison. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of Thomas' life. He was held in Lefortovo prison, a notorious detention facility in eastern Moscow, where political prisoners and foreign spies were held during interrogation and trial. The conditions were harsh but not brutal. He was given food, water, and medical care. But he was isolated, confined to a cell for 23 hours a day, with only brief periods of exercise in a small concrete yard. He had no contact with the outside world, no access to news, no communication with anyone except his attorney and his interrogators. He did not know if the CIA was aware of his situation, if they were working to negotiate his release, or if they had already written him off as a lost asset. The uncertainty was worse than the confinement. The trial began on June 15th as scheduled. It was held in a small courtroom inside a military facility on the outskirts of Moscow. The proceedings were closed to the public, with only a handful of military officers, prosecutors, and Thomas' defense attorney present. The prosecution presented its case methodically. They introduced surveillance photographs, audio recordings of conversations Thomas had with Irina Voronova that were deemed suspicious, and testimony from KGB officers who had observed his behavior at Mosfilm. They presented the camera equipment that had been seized from Thomas' hotel room, including the fountain pen with the hidden lens and the electronic scanner. They argued that Thomas had entered the Soviet Union under false pretenses, that he had attempted to access classified military installations, and that he had engaged in espionage on behalf of the United States government. Thomas' defense was limited. Viktor Petrov argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the camera equipment could be explained as tools of his trade as a filmmaker, and that the surveillance photographs showed nothing more than a curious visitor exploring a film studio. But the judges, 3 senior military officers appointed by the court, were not persuaded. On June 17th, after 2 days of testimony and deliberation, they delivered their verdict. Thomas Archer was found guilty of espionage. He was sentenced to 12 years in a labor camp in the Perm region of the Urals, one of the harshest penal facilities in the Soviet Union. Thomas was transferred to the camp in late June. The journey took 3 days, traveling by train in a cramped prisoner transport car with barred windows and no heat. When he arrived, he was processed, given a prison uniform, and assigned to a work detail in a logging operation. The camp was brutal. The winters were long and bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping below -30 degrees Celsius. The work was physically exhausting, cutting timber in frozen forests for 10 hours a day, with inadequate food and minimal rest. Many prisoners did not survive their sentences. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed lives regularly, and the authorities showed little concern for the welfare of those they classified as enemies of the state. Thomas endured. He kept his head down, followed orders, and avoided conflict with other prisoners or guards. He survived the first winter, then the second. He learned to ration his strength, to conserve energy, to find small moments of warmth and rest wherever he could. He thought often about his family, about the life he had left behind, about the choices that had led him to this place. He wondered if anyone remembered him, if the CIA was still working on his case, or if he had been forgotten entirely. Years passed. Thomas aged rapidly under the conditions of the camp. His hair turned grey. His body grew thin and worn, but he refused to break. He refused to confess, refused to cooperate, refused to give the KGB the satisfaction of seeing him surrender. In October of 1989, after 6 years and 4 months in the labor camp, Thomas Archer was included in a prisoner exchange negotiated between the United States and the Soviet Union. He was transported to a border crossing in East Germany, where he was handed over to American officials in exchange for 3 Soviet intelligence officers who had been arrested in the United States on espionage charges. Thomas crossed into West Berlin on October 12, 1989. He was 47 years old, physically broken, but alive. He was debriefed by CIA officers over the following weeks, providing detailed accounts of his arrest, his interrogation, and his imprisonment. He learned that the agency had never stopped working on his case, that they had negotiated tirelessly for his release, and that he had not been forgotten. But he also learned that the cost of his operation had been high. The CIA had lost access to several intelligence sources in Moscow after his arrest, as the KGB had used his case to identify and neutralize other Western operatives. The mission to penetrate Object 47 had failed, and Thomas himself would never fully recover from the physical and psychological damage he had endured. He retired from the CIA in 1990. He returned to the United States, moved to a small town in Vermont, and lived quietly for the remainder of his life. He rarely spoke about his time in Moscow or the years he spent in the labor camp. The memories were too painful, the losses too great. He died in 2007 at the age of 65, alone in his home with no family present. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his service to his country, no reference to the years he had spent behind enemy lines, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices he had made. Thomas Archer had been a spy, a man who had risked everything for a mission that had failed. And in the end, like so many others who had served in the shadows during the Cold War, he had been forgotten. The story of how the KGB caught Thomas Archer inside Mosfilm is not a story of heroism or triumph. It is a story of surveillance, patience, and the relentless machinery of a totalitarian state that saw every foreigner as a potential threat and every act of curiosity as evidence of espionage. It is a story of a man who believed in his mission, who followed his training, and who paid a price that no amount of success could have justified. And it is a reminder that in the world of intelligence, victory and defeat are often indistinguishable, separated only by the arbitrary lines drawn by history and the choices made by men who rarely live to see the consequences of their actions.